Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you first for our interpreters. I know it will be a tough job for today. Yes. But I would like to welcome Professor Walter Mignolo on behalf of the International Institute for Cultural Studies, the Institute of Social Research and Cultural Studies, and the International Program of Inter-Asia Cultural Studies. So Professor Mignolo is currently at Duke University as William Wanamaker Professor of Roman Studies in Trinity College, Art and Sciences, and Center for Global Studies and the Humanities. The reason for us to invite Professor Mignolo here to give this lecture series is because that our colleagues and students here are all very concerned with the questions of coloniality in the post-colonial age, okay, and in this neoliberal age, and especially the unequal power relations in our contemporary societies. Situated in Taiwan here, actually with close historical, cultural, economic, and political connections with Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, and also with students from local societies, but also from abroad, with different cultural and historical backgrounds. We are actually very familiar with a complex matrix of historical, discursive, and also political-economic conditions that cause different forms of social conflicts in contemporary inter-Asian societies. We engage ourselves with the questions of the rise of China, it's obvious, and its impact with its political, economic, and cultural politics on neighboring societies. But also, we also research into his ideological, rhetorical strategies of traditional Confucianism and how it could suture into neoliberal discourse. But we also want to question the condition, the situation of this poverty gap that's obvious in East Asia and Southeast Asia, and the invisible communities, the increasing invisible communities and unequal citizenship caused by this global capitalism and the politics of citizenship that exclude the irregular population and migrant workers. So the aim of our joint project that we have been working on with colleagues of different institutes is to research into the geohistorical factors that constitute the aporia of the community of equals, particularly in our region, and to seek the possible route for decoloniality. And over the past 30 years, Professor Mignolo has been working on this agenda, this issue, especially his research and teachings has been devoted to this question of the historical foundations of modern colonial world system and imaginaries since 15,000. In his research, as we are well known, modern and colonial world system and imaginary is tantamount to the historical foundations of Western civilization and its expansion around the globe. And through this long period of time of his research, he has published important, significant works, especially Local History, Global Design, Coloniality, Subaltern Knowledge, and Border Thinking, but also the darker side of Western Modernity, Global Futures, Decolonial Options, and the idea of Latin America, and the darker side of Renaissance, literacy, territoriality, and colonization. This book actually had its widespread readership, and it's being translated into German, Italian, French, Sweden, Romania, Spanish, Portuguese, Korean, and Chinese, of course. And the key concepts, I would say, in his works are CMP, as he said, colonial matrix of power, that is constituted through the geopolitics of knowledge and erasing and subalternizing local knowledge and colonial differences. And in order to delink and to resist, he proposed de-subalternization of knowledge or epistemic disobedience, like civil disobedience, but this is a further radical and fundamental task to through epistemic disobedience and epistemic delinking, and to exercise border thinking in order to revive the differences that's being suppressed. In recent 10 or 15 years, Professor Mignolo has devoted more and more to the public sphere, including working with artists, curators, journalists. This is what he calls decolonial aesthetics that everyone should and could practice. And the 3 lectures, starting from today, as you see, we have the booklet that's sequenced from today, and tomorrow will be in Taipei, and Friday next week will be here again. We are going to translate this lecture series along with his representative text, and along with our discussions here, our commentaries, and also the forum that we are going to have next Friday with our doctoral students. 5 representatives will be here and raise sharp questions, but also their personal projects. So the whole thing will be produced as a book in Chinese very soon. Okay, and I believe this lecture series brought by Professor Mignolo will stimulate rigorous and discussions and debates on the question of coloniality among our audience here, and also would generate more scholarship and activist interventions in different forms in the near future. So let's welcome Professor Walter Mignolo to speak.
Thank you. Well, hello. I see a lot of young faces. I like that. This is a very complex world that we are, and that will be yours. You will have to live in that world, right? So thank you very much. I am really kind of pleased and overwhelmed with this reception here and the book that has been printed. I want to go, for those of you who have the book, I will say, read first Geopolitics of Knowledge and the Colonial Difference, which is an article of 2003, because everything else kind of is based on that. Geopolitics, we know that geopolitics is an imperial concept, but I mean, we are kind of borrowing it in order to talk about geopolitics of knowledge. And in talking about geopolitics of knowledge, we kind of de-universalize Western knowledge. Western knowledge is regional, but piggyback on imperialism and make us believe that is universal knowledge. So I think that the book by Guangxin Chen, Asia as Method, is a good example of what geopolitics of knowledge means, right? Asia was an object of studies for the social science in the West, especially in the United States, when area studies began. And so Guangxin Chen said, well, that's enough. Now we will think the world through Asia. And I think the world through South America and the Caribbean. And well, people think the world from Germany or United States. The problem is that people who think the world from Germany, France, or United States, they think that this is it. So that is why the geopolitical knowledge, the important thing is the enunciation. Who is pronouncing, who is producing the discourse? So we have to pay attention to that. We have to pay attention to the saying more than to the said, right? Because again, all Western epistemology make us believe that what is said by some kind of authority is the truth. I think one of the important things of Trump is that he kind of knocked down this pretense of truth, right? He kind of took the clothes off to that fiction that is the concept of truth, right? So truth in relation to what? Well, let me also say that I'm very pleased to be here because even if my, let's say my experience is the Atlantic, the South Atlantic and the North Atlantic and US and the Pacific, when I began to think the world, and that was, I don't remember, probably 1985, 1990, when I was writing The Darker Side of the Renaissance, and we would. So I became interested in Asia, East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and West Asia, that is the Middle East from the other side, right? And I have the luck of being a Duke, and we came the same year to Duke with Liu Qing, that many of you may know. So even if there is a gap of generational gap, we have become very good friends from the very beginning because of common interest, and I have learned a lot from him about this part of the world. So everything that I know, I kind of, it's a big deal that I owe to Liu Qing. I read, of course, my own, but Liu Qing it's always when I have a question, I send a message or let's have a cup of coffee, and okay. So, what I wanna, you know that, right? That more people live inside of the circle than outside. And you also know that the conversation of the irreversible shift to the Eastern Hemisphere is already a kind of topic of debate, but also kind of a reality. A reality, and the fact that more people live inside the circle than outside of it, and that capitalism came here, well, that is unstoppable. And that is part of the problem. And we will see a little bit more of that. Well, that is a kind of general introduction. Now, how do I do that? Like this. You know, people talk a lot about praxis, right? And theory and praxis. Well, theory is a praxis. Althusser said that, right? The theoretical practice of Marx or something like that. But I will say something different. There is only one basic praxis, which is the praxis of living. If we don't live, there is no other praxis. So the praxis of living is fundamental to think about it. Because today, the alienation is such that the praxis of living is not being at the center of consideration, and people want to save the banks and want to save capitalism, but not to save people. So it's urgent to kind of place the praxis of living at the center of everything we do. We do what we do because we are alive. If we are not alive, we cannot say it. So, I am thinking now that even if I was, instead of a semiotician and a humanist and dealing with the social science, I would have studied mathematics or theoretical physics or astronomy, I would be saying the same thing basically. Because astronomy is something that we invent because of the practice of living. And theoretical physics is something we invent because of the practice of living. And that is part of the conversation that put us together and also in debate, etc. So I was born in a very small town in Argentina, 10,000, I mean in the country, and then my folks went to that small town when I was 7 to send me to school. 10,000 people. When I was a teenager, 15,000 now. So what is that town? That town is about there. See, Buenos Aires, Córdoba, I went to the university there, and the town is there is called La Pampa Gringa. La Pampa Gringa, gringo doesn't mean Gringolandia. Gringo means the Italian immigrants. So that is where all the kind of Italian immigrants at the end of 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th, landed. They got small pieces of land, and that's it. When you go to the cemetery of the area and you see all the kind of the history of the Italian families that are still. So that was my education. I mean, education, not just the school, the education, the practice of living. Right? I was educated because I was living, but not just at the school. Just, and that has a lot to do with what I have been doing later on. And the fact that I didn't feel Argentinian. I mean, there was no, immigration was different at that time, so all my family have citizenship. I get my ID, Argentinian ID, when I was 18, but I didn't feel Argentinian. The country belonged to different people. The country belonged to the family that kind of settled there in the 18th century, got the gold piece of land, negotiated with the British, with the French, etc. But I didn't know how to explain that. It was a feeling. So the practice of living made me sense that something was not quiet. So when I start doing this kind of research, is because everything I do since 81, 82, 85 is biographical. It's just to understand myself. But understanding myself, understanding a lot of people in Argentina, understanding a lot of people who move and who do not belong. It's not just subaltern, but it's just the sense of non-belonging. So when you have the sense of non-belonging, you are in the border. You dwell in the border. You don't dwell any longer in a territory. That territory may be a state, a local. You dwell in the border. So border thinking comes from the experience of living. When you dwell in the border, you do in the border and you think in the border. And you began to see the difference with the people who think in the territory. And that began to kind of distance me, even if I went to study in France, this began to distance me from European thought. Because all European thought, be it German or British or French or Spanish or Italian, are territorial. They build the idea of Europe, right? But the rest of us, you in Taiwan, me in Argentina, etc., we are something else, right? And we have to deal with that. That's my work. That is my research. That's my teaching, and that's my living. That's my practice of life. So that's our introduction. Let me see. the topic of today is decoloniality after decolonization and Dewesternization after the Cold War. I will tell you at the beginning what I mean by that, and then I will tell you a story, how do we get here? And depending on the time, I may finish the story or just cut it in the middle, but doesn't matter because you know where I'm going. You know what the thesis is, right? So this is very important. I don't know how much all of you, I don't know if they're students from the first year, how much you follow the news of the world disorder today. What I'm going to say is based on the history of the past 500 years to understand what is going on today. So I tell you the thesis, and then I tell you the story how we get here. But before that, I know you are very much concerned about China, right? And you think that United States may be a way out or support or just at least stop China to kind of put in the pause on Taiwan. Well, in South America, we have exactly the same problem with the United States since the 60s, right? And because of that, about 10 years ago, with Brazil of Lula, Argentina of Kirchner, still Bolivia of Evo Morales, Ecuador Correa, they began to make negotiations with Russia, China, and Iran. So here you think that the United States will save you. Over there, we think that Iran, China, and Russia will protect us from the United States. So that is very, very, very important. And the question is, when we think about any state, big state like China, small state like Taiwan, or Argentina probably is medium size, we have to always think simultaneously about two dimensions of the state. One is domestic, and the other is interstate. So domestic, I don't know much about the domestic in Taiwan or Indonesia or Korea. I mean, I know the general things that is in the news. So I pay a lot of attention to the interstate. And the interstate relation, and this is where this formula come into the picture. The most dangerous state today for the world peace is United States. Why? Because United States inherited the privilege that Europe built for 450 years until World War II. Well, the United States was already a big, was moving next to Japan, but it was after World War II that the United States took the leadership of the world. And it was uncontested, right? For at least 50 years until 2000, it was uncontested. So a lot of people today talk about Brexit and talk about Trump and talk about the danger of the right in Europe. The problem here is the collapse of the Soviet Union. That is where all things, not began, but the big transformation. That is when, the end of history. Now, neoliberalism will kind of homogenize the world. So that's a lot of privilege. And when you have privilege, it's very difficult to lose them. And all of a sudden, China began to challenge those privileges. And Russia, when they recomposed themselves after the collapse of the Soviet Union, began to challenge them. And Iran always challenged that since the Iranian Revolution, except that Iran has less visibility and less power than in relation to. And then came the BRICS, and then the Infrastructure Development Bank. So the question is that the privilege began to be disputed. So United States, with the support of Europe, they were able to knock down Saddam Hussein. They were able to knock down Gaddafi. They tried with al-Assad, but they couldn't. And they tried to move east by organizing the coup d'etat in Ukraine, but they couldn't because Putin knew what was going on. So in that sense, we have 500 years of westernization of the world. So the Western civilization began to be built since the Renaissance and expand all over the world. 500 years of westernization until de-westernization after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So what is de-westernization? De-westernization is capitalist. Socialism is gone. Right? We are no longer in a Cold War. The Cold War was a fight between two Western ideologies, liberalism and Marxism. Right? De-westernization, and what happened with Marxism? Marxism kind of, like also with Mao, Stalin, Russia, the Soviet Union and Mao, they kind of block the past, memories, spirituality, church, because they were secular. So the difference between the Cold War, between liberalism and communism, between between liberal capitalism and state capitalism, is no longer the case today. And what is the difference between de-westernization and Marxism? Is that de-westernization kind of revamped the past. For example, in China, the discussion about Confucianism. When the intellectuals and Chinese leaders said, well, we will never go the kind of the liberal democracy like the West. So they start talking about Confucian constitutionalism. Well, they have to kind of base themselves in something that is in their own memories. When I say that in the West, we say, but Confucianism is used by the state with the purpose of the state. And I say, yes, you're absolutely right. So that is what the West does with the concept of democracy. The West used democracy to justify invasion power and etc. So we have to recognize that democracy is based on the memories of the West, but not in the memory of Iran, not in the memory of Russia, not in the memory of China, not in the memory of Nigeria or South Africa, etc. So de-westernization brings go back into the past, but not to go back into the past, to kind of reinscribe the past in the present over the future and confront westernization. Yeah? You understand what I mean? Yeah? So de-westernization after the Cold War. And that is possible because of capitalism. Without economic strength, China cannot confront politically the West and militarily, right? Without capitalist strength, Putin cannot confront. And I'm not defending Putin. I'm not defending Putin, no Obama, no Clinton, no Trump. I'm trying to understand the inter-state game at this moment in which we will talk tomorrow in Taipei. This is not the end of capitalism. I don't know how long capitalism will go, but it's the end of Western domination. And it's the end of Western domination, and de-westernization is part of that, right? Okay, so that's one part of de-Westernization after the Cold War. And notice that I don't use post. I don't use post-Cold War. I don't use post at all. Because post keeps us on the one line of time that is the Western line. When you say post, there is only one history. And because there is only one history, you don't have any place to go but post. I don't want to go there. I want to bring the space into the confrontation. So de-Westernization coexists with Westernization and with re-Westernization. Because what Obama did after the collapse of the Bush-Cheney presidency, that is when, after the fiasco of Iraq, everybody began to realize that this is a joke. I mean, Tony Blair and so Obama trying to regain that leadership, and the first thing that Obama did was the discourse in Cairo. That is the first moment of re-Westernization. And then, November of 2011, Clinton was Secretary of State in Hawaii. This is the 21st century. It's the Pacific American century. Forget Iraq, forget Afghanistan, the Chinese are coming. So let's move to the Pacific. So in that they were trying to regain until today. So we have Westernization, and this is a struggle we see, the interstate struggle. And in South America, and I won't talk about Africa, but in South America, it's more or less like in Asia. There are some states that want to go with re-Westernization, and some states that, as I said before, they go with China, Russia. And here too, you have Duterte, you have Indonesia that are kind of moving closer to China. So that is what we will see. We will see for some decades if there is not a nuclear. I don't think will be a nuclear war, but but we will see that struggle. So now, what is decolonization and decoloniality? All right. During the Cold War, what was the goal of decolonization? That was the word that everybody used, right? The goal of decolonization was mainly in Asia and Africa, because in South America we did that in the 19th century. Right? We were doing something else. I will tell you if you are interested, while you here were fighting for decolonization. But the goal of decolonization was that the natives would send the imperial guy home to France, England, and the Netherlands, and control the states. And they did it. Right? They did it in India, they did it in North Africa, they did it in Sub-Saharan Africa. And what happened? Failure. By the 90s, was clear that decolonization failed. Why it failed? It failed because of 2 or 3 reasons. One is that the elite in each country took control of the state and the economy, and continued to negotiate with the imperial guys who went home. That happened in South America exactly the same in the 19th century. So the revolutionaries sent the imperial guy home, and that, at that moment were the Spanish and the French, and they began to negotiate with England and France, right? And so that's one of the reasons of the failure of decolonization. The second reason of the failure, I mean, that was more interest of the elite. I mean, we saw in Egypt and all the kind of the Arab Spring are kind of consequences of the insatisfaction of the failures that kind of manifested in the people. The second reason is that decolonization didn't question neither political theory nor political economy. they just took the car and rode with the political theory and the political economy that was all kind of fabricated in the West according to Western memories. So the nation state, I don't want to go to the monarchic state, but the nation state that in the West emerged in the after the French Revolution and after the Glorious Revolution, I mean, and Westphalia, etc., but basically at the end of 18th century or beginning of 19th century, that nation state came out of the so-called natural history of Europe. And the nation state, secular, is necessary because Europe has been killing each other, the Europeans, in the religious war. So they have to separate the church of the state. They need it. But then when they go to the Middle East and you have to separate the church of the state, they say, what are you talking about? Right? So they didn't question that political theory. So that was the failure of decolonization. And the decolonization wanted to take control of the state. So we are talking now Dewesternization after the Cold War and decoloniality after decolonization. So what is decoloniality? What is the goal of decoloniality? So the example here, I mean, the example and the kind of reference point are the Zapatistas. The Zapatistas said, we don't want the state, you keep it. We want autonomy. We want to be autonomous, and they are managing to do that. The Zapatistas are autonomous within the state of Mexico, but they have their autonomy. They have their territorial autonomy, they have their own education, their own textbook, their own escuelitas, they have their own kind of health, and they have their own kind of communal life. So decoloniality is no longer interested in taking the state, because you cannot decolonize the state. In Bolivia, what people were talking about, the state is part of the colonial Mexico power. So the question is not to decolonize the state, but the question is to think about different forms of governance, because the state is not necessarily universal. The nation state has a function in Europe, and was easier in Europe. Why? Because European population at that time was more or less homogeneous. Right? There were Jews, there were Romans, but the majority were kind of white Christian. But when you take the state to India or to Bolivia, the population is not homogeneous anymore. So what do you do? I mean, in Europe it was very easy to say one state, one nation. In Bolivia you have 4 or 5, in India you have many nations. So the question now, the political theory of the moment is plurinational state. One state, but many nations. So there is no one nation that has the right to control the state. And if you look at the United States now, that is going on, although nobody talks about that. Because the United States of America is controlled by the Anglo-white. But if you think from this perspective, multiculturalism, what is multiculturalism? There are many nations. Are the Asian American, are the Native American, are the Afro-American, and the Native American, etc. So United States is moving into a kind of plurinational state. Now, a plurinational state, I am not saying that this is a solution. I don't know what the solution is. But the question is that outside of Europe, and Europe in the future, with immigration and the refugees, each state of Europe is becoming more and more a plurinational state. So what is decoloniality? What does decolonial want? And I think the linking. The linking, I tell you a story here. I was in a fantastic discussion, the debate in a Congress 4 or 5 years ago in Canada. And Canada is fascinating because, I mean, you have the First Nation are very powerful. You have the Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean. You have immigration, and the immigrants are very well organized from different Asia, from Africa, etc. So there was all this kind of nation, right? And we were discussing that. And what people were talking about, I mean, that's what many indigenous Canadians say. I say, we don't want to do anything. We don't want to be recognized by the state. Who is the state to recognize us? Right? See, we were here before the settler came, and now we have to beg for recognition. No, thank you. So what they are talking about indigeneity and decoloniality. So the question is to reconstitute themselves, their communal, their form of governance, their form of living, their education, health, etc. Right? So there you have a very important, clear example of what decoloniality means at this moment. And that means also rebuild knowledge. We cannot just build communal knowledge with the kind of theory that produced in Germany or France or England or whatever. You have to produce your own theory. You have to produce your own theory knowing that the Western theories are upon you. You cannot ignore that. And that's what border thinking emerged. Because you think from dwelling in the border, dwelling in your place, but your place is a border because you are already confronted with 500 years, 300 years, or 200 years for you. So I was in that conversation, and everybody was about the linking and kind of autonomy and all these kind of things. So we finished, and so I was walking, and there is a guy, a Canadian guy, said, Professor Mignolo, this is a fantastic conversation. This is, but I am a white, heterosexual Canadian. If I delink, where do I go? So the immigrants have where to go. They have to build, the indigenous have to go. The Afro-Caribbean, they have to, but the Canadian, where do I go? So that is the key point of decoloniality. And the key point of decoloniality is not resistance. I don't think that you should not resist, you should resist. But you should know the limit of resistance. When you resist, you play the game that has been already set for you. You don't like it, you resist. But you lose all the time. Because there is somebody else who controls the game, who organized the game, the state, for example. So the question of decoloniality is not resist, but re-exist. So the linking goes together with re-existence. And how you re-exist, I cannot tell you that. That is as far as I can go. Because re-existing, you have to imagine. I mean, you not as individual, but you have to imagine with the people that feel like you, that you don't feel satisfied, you need something, you don't like it, and you resist. But if you resist, you don't have your life. So your life has to be re-existence. And re-existence for Afro-American, or for Muslim, or for Chinese, or for Taiwanese, or for whatever, is different. Because we have different memories, we have different histories, we have different sensibilities. So decoloniality is re-existence and connecting. Connecting globally now that we have internet and all this kind of thing. Not to tell other people how to do it, not to dominate other people or re-existence, but to working together. So this is the point of the talk, and then if there is time, I keep on talking. So at this point, there is another thing you have to get out of your mind if it still is there. We have re-Westernization, de-Westernization, and decoloniality. Don't ask me who will win. There is no winner anymore. I mean, there is no one hegemony. Westernization, re-Westernization cannot be hegemonic anymore. De-Westernization, a lot of people in the West that China or Russia want to take over. I don't know if they want to take over, but what I know is that even if they want, they can't. They can't because the West is strong. But the West can no longer take over because China and Russia and Iran and more people are saying, well, no, enough is enough. So the decolonial is neither Westernization nor de-Westernization, but decoloniality re-existing. Have to figure out. I mean, the Zapatistas figure it out. People are kind of organizing themselves because they cannot expect that the banks and the state will solve the problem. We know now that domestically, the nation or the nations or the people don't count anymore. The states are not concerned about the people. The states are concerned about kind of getting the strength to compete with other states, right? Trump, I mean, with the politics of Trump, you know, yesterday he announced that Ford company goes back and he says, job, 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 job. Well, think about that. Of course, in 2008, when, I mean, the unemployment went skyrocket. Of course, somebody who had tenure was not concerned about that. But at the same time, you start thinking, it's tragic not to have a job and not to have money to just put food on the table for your family. But what's also tragic that the people who lost employment were waiting for the employment to get back. Meaning they lost the capacity to create and invent by themselves. But there was a generation of the 25, 35 who began to say, we are not unemployed, we are non-employed because we are not looking for jobs anymore. So what do? They try to figure out a life on their own. They have, because they say, I don't want to give my life, my body, my mind for people who are making money and then kind of disregarding. So that is part also of the linking. It's difficult to do it, but I think it's important to start thinking about it. How to have a life that is not at the service of the state, it's not at the service of the bank, it's not at the service of the corporation. And it's a lot of things to do there. The question of race, the question of sexuality, the question of all this kind of, that is part of the re-existence. You cannot expect that the state will solve the problem of racism or will resolve the problem of sexism. May do something, may do some kind of equality. But that has to come from the people who suffer the consequences of racism, of sexism, of class, etc. Well, that is the thesis. How many minutes we have?
10, 15 minutes.
10, 15 minutes? Because the next step that is more or less clear what I am proposing. You don't have to agree, but it's clear what I am proposing, right? So my next step. How did we get here? So to explain how we got here, to understand everything I said, how that happened, go back to 1500. So if you read David Harvey or Habermas or all these kind of people of the North Atlantic, even Said, they started, even Foucault. Foucault goes a little bit farther, 17th century, the second half of the 17th century. They cannot go. And I am not criticizing them. I am saying that is their bodies. They have been way of sensing. They don't sense beyond the 17th century. But if you were born in South America, you don't have to be an Indian, and you don't have to be a descendant of African slave to know what happened in 1500. That is where our story begins. There is many ways to tell the beginning, no? I see God, the paradise, Mahoma, or the black holes, or whatever. I mean, there are stories. There are stories. There are stories that make sense of something, that make sense to you and to the people who you talk to. Well, for us, the world started in 1500. Of course, doesn't mean that nothing was before 1500. But 1500, something very important happened, and you won't be in this situation now, if not for the collapse of the Soviet Union, but also 1500. 1500 is the first time in the history of the humankind, that is a big statement, it's the first time in the history of the humankind that the world became connected. People in the old world knew the old world, I mean the old world, Asia, Europe, and Africa. People over there knew, not America, because America didn't exist, but they knew Tawantinsuyo, Anahuac, Turtle Island, Abya-Yala, that were kind of the name of, and I will say, let me kind of challenge you here. You didn't live in Asia until 1582. For you, Asia didn't exist until there was a kind of what is the heaven, the kingdom of heaven, what is the Chinese expression for that? Asia is not ontological entity. Asia was a continent for the Christians. They have Asia, Shem, the good son of Noah. Africa was Ham, the bad son of Noah. And Japheth, the breath, the future. Right? That was the way. So it's in why 1582? Because the Jesuits came here. The Jesuits came here. I will have to jump a little bit here. Probably this way. I want to go up. Up. So you see, you're probably familiar with this map, right? I mean, with the Pacific in the center. So the Jesuits came here with an Ortelius map that I don't have it here, but see, this is the problem. This is what happened in 1500 for the first time. So globalization started there, but was not globalization, was globalism, because of the Christian project. It's not globalization make you believe that there is something happening. No, it's not something happening. There is something, somebody is making it happen. So at this point was not neoliberalism, was Christianity that kind of trying to homogenize the world, right? So what you see here, and this was, there was the Mercator map, 1542, and there was Ortelius map, 1570, where for the first time in the history of humankind, you see the masses of land and the masses of water that we're so familiar with. But in 1500, still people didn't see the world like we see it today. Now here, before going to Asia, this is where all began. The Pope, Alexander VI, decided in 1495 or so, 92, I don't remember, before 1500, to appropriate half of the planet and give it to the Spanish and the Portuguese. Imagine the arrogance of the Pope. So don't be surprised about Trump. I mean, that's his long history that comes from this kind of arrogance, right? So this is the Treaty of Tordesillas, and here you have Castilla, and this belonged to Portugal. Huh? You didn't know that this was going on here, right? I mean, your ancestors have no idea what the Christians were doing, right? In 1529, the King of Spain and the King of Portugal liked the idea of the Pope. And so the Treaty of Zaragoza, they divided the Indias Orientales. So at this point, yes, you were, I mean, people here were living in Indias Orientales, but people here didn't know that they were living in Indias Orientales because that was a Christian invention. You see how important is the enunciation, right? And there, here is where we began to be connected, you and us, because in 1620 or something like that, 1636, the Portuguese created Macau, and the Spanish was in Manila, and the Portuguese and then the Spanish were in Formosa. Formosa is Taiwan, because it's beautiful, La Isla Hermosa, right? So you see, we already connected at the beginning of the kind of the modern colonial world, right? So in 1582, the Jesuits came to Japan and China, and there was a Jesuit called Matteo Ricci from Rome, who the story is telling himself telling. He went to Japan and then went to Beijing, and they created a kind of mission, Jesuit mission. And apparently he invited the intellectual of the Ming Dynasty and showed the Mercator map that more or less is projected. And apparently the intellectual of the Ming Dynasty says, very interesting, but if China is in the center, why you put it on the right upper hand? Right? So you see, very interesting shock. For Ricci, the center was Rome. For the Chinese, the center was Beijing. And if I take for the Incas, it was Cusco. Right? So what happened is, apparently, the narrative, Matteo Ricci said, okay. 2 weeks later, he came back, invited them back, and showed that, with the Pacific in the center. So China now is more into the center. So in that sense, it's that your ancestors didn't know that they lived in Asia until 1582. Because Asia is not a concept that comes in the history of Asian people. Asia is a concept, America too. America is a Christian invention. Christian and secular invention. Okay, so what I was trying to say, how we get here, is what happened in 16th century, in the 1500s. There is a really a radical transformation of the human history on Earth, but also on living organisms on Earth that will be affected after the Industrial Revolution. But there is no Industrial Revolution without 1500. So what happened in 1500? Number one, there were never before, and I will finish with that, give me 10 more minutes, never before in the history of the humankind was such a massive appropriation of land. Well, you remember the map. You imagine all the Americas? So the history of possession and dispossession. Where there were no people, were possession. Well, then the Spanish have to, and the Portuguese, justify dispossession. Dispossession is not something recent. Dispossession goes there. And what is the main instrument of dispossession? International law. There is no international law until 1500. There was Roman law, I mean there was natural law, divine law, human law, but international law. International law emerged in Spain as a need to justify possession and dispossession of land. And then 80 years later comes Grotius, and Grotius does for the Dutch, who were coming here with the East Indian Company, exactly the same that the School of Salamanca was doing in Spain, and then come Locke, and that's exactly the same with, for North America. So, massive appropriation and expropriation of land. Second, international law to justify it. Third, once you have such a tremendous amount of land, what you need? Labor. Huh? So the Indians were dying for several reasons, so bring slaves. So slavery, well, yeah, we know that was a slave in Greece, right? And slavery is not a new institution. But the amount, the massive amount of a slave trade, and the fact that even if at the beginning not every slave were African black, by the end of the 16th century, slavery and blackness was the same. So that's the third. The fourth is racism. Racism, as we know it today, originate there in the 16th century. And why originate there? Because you cannot exploit, expropriate, enslave, and equal. You have to make people inferior. And racism is this technology of making people inferior. But in order to make people inferior, you have to control knowledge. Because, I mean, racism is not an ontological. Yeah, there are people who have black skin. Yeah, well, so what? You have to have knowledge to convince people that having black skin is not human. So racism is emerged with the idea of human with big H. Of all the human beings, there are some humans, and those humans are male. And then you have racists and sexists all together, right? So there you have the foundation of what we call the colonial matrix of power. And this is very important, what I'm going to say. I am not using the colonial matrix of power to explain history. I am using history to explain the colonial matrix of power. That is crucial. See, the colonial matrix of power, to pedagogically, and I finish with this, pedagogically, you can say it's like the unconscious in Freud. You don't see the unconscious, right? What you see or what you hear is the narrative of the analysant. right? So Freud is not using the unconscious to interpret the analysis. He's using the history of the analysis to understand the unconscious. So that's decolonial thinking. This is a basic, is the linking, in this case, is the linking not from the state, it's the linking from Western epistemology. It's the linking from the theory and praxis. It's the linking that separating the known from the knower. I kind of lost the train of thought here. Oh yeah. So what is important here, crucial here, is the colonial mixture of power is not a tool to analyze some kind of empirical reality. It's through empirical reality that we are trying to understand how the colonial mixture of power works. And I finish with the next point. The colonial mixture of power is not something that can be studied from outside. Because we are all in the colonial mixture of power. It's like the movie The Matrix. There is no outside, right? To understand the colonial mixture of power, we have to begin to understand what are we, where we have been located. But in order to understand how we have been located, we have to understand the history, the formation and the transformation of the colonial mixture of power. Right? There is no outside. So Marx said, we all know, it's enough to interpret the world, we have to transform it. Fine, fair enough. The question is, you cannot transform the world if the people who live in the world don't transform themselves. So decoloniality starts from this kind of reflection that is not a kind of narcissism, is a kind of understanding how the politics and economy and racism and sexism and knowledge have all of us trapped. So in the last analysis, the linking is the linking from the colonial mixture of power. But you cannot link all at once, like a revolution, you take. And that's where people are working. So you have to link from authority, from gender sexuality, knowledge and subjectivity, economy, etc., etc. So what you have to understand also is that this reconstruction comes from how modernity built the image of the world. Okay? Now, you cannot understand economy without understanding the relationship economy with the rest. So tomorrow, well, you won't be here, but my second talk is the end of Western hegemony, not the end of capitalism. It's because that structure is continuing in the struggle between Westernization and Dewesternization. Dewesternization is not questioning the colonial mixture of power. What they are questioning is who managed it. So it's enough that this has been built and managed by the West. Now that is, but decoloniality said, we want to just link from that. That is a problem with you guys, right? We don't want to have anything to say with it. So if you understand gender and sexuality, you cannot understand gender and sexuality without authority, which is politics, economy, knowledge and subjectivity, race, etc. So that is a way to kind of start thinking about how we have been, the question of identity. Who am I? The question of identity is who I am, who am I in relation to somebody who make me see in their own eyes, right? And that is a very important concept of Fanon, sociogenesis. Sociogenesis is, well, he knew that he had a black skin. He didn't know he was a Negro, because being a Negro is more than having black skin. Being a Negro is a classification in the kind of the context of a racial classification of people. Well, I hope that I give you an idea of the Dewesternization, decoloniality, and an idea of where this is coming from. So I didn't have time to go through a summary of 500 years of history, but at least I give you the basis that you can imagine what happened between 1500 and 2000 and 2002, or the second decade of the 21st century. Okay, thank you very much. I hope that makes some sense.
Let's take a 15 minutes break, and then we'll follow up with Professor Broussard's comment and a Q&A session. Whatever Professor Mignolo hasn't fully elaborated could be continue in the second session. So let's take a break. Yes.